You're listening to The Bone Fields by Mitchell Lüthi, performed by Anna Capraro and Scott Miller, produced by Citadel Studios for Sentinel Creatives. Longships. Toril braced against the cold wind and gripped her oar tight as the storm buffeted the longship Varúlfr. Beneath them, all around them, the ocean was a broiling black cauldron, heaving its might against their own. It had not yet found them wanting. Inga hunched up beside her and grinned madly as the sea crashed over the side of the longboat. Her shaven head was lathered with sweat and rain, and the tattoos that covered her skin shone as though freshly inked. "Lüthi's in one of his moods again." Toril spat out salt water and wiped her lips. "He's always angry this time of year. Hubbard was foolish to make us stay for so long." She stared along the aisles, past the ragged band of figures that made up the rest of the company. Hubbard stood at Varúlfr's helm, unbowed by the frantic gale that hammered the ship. His long hair was soaked through, matted against his head and neck. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, in search of their sister ship, Citadel, who had disappeared into the storm. "Hubbard's raids are always the most rewarding. That is why he chose to stay, and that is why we chose to come. This old god's anger is a small price for what we have taken." Toril nodded. It had been a bountiful raid, and Hubbard's company had made enough for them all to secure land and power upon their return home. They had stuck to the coast at first, like any other raiding party, and taken what they could from the farms they found there. But Hubbard was ambitious, and they'd soon found themselves sneaking into larger settlements and then sacking them. It had been slaughter, but one well worth the wait. She glanced over her shoulder, towards the covered stern of the boat. She'd even managed to secure a slave on this expedition, her first. He sat huddled up beside two others, shivering into his soaking rags. Fritjof better not have gotten himself lost. Inga squinted her eyes against the rain. Or sailed Kveldefjord to the ocean floor. Then we'll never see half our spoils. Afterlife or no, I'll hunt him down and wring his thin neck until his eyes pop out. Inga had another reason for wanting to see Kveldefjord again. Her lover Aix sailed with Fritjof. The warrior had spurned her advances at first, but Inga was not easily dissuaded. The first night on Bretland soil had seen them share a bedroll, and they'd spent every night together since. Not even Fritjof would dare sink his ship when he carries Hubbard's cargo. You will see, once the storm relents, then you will see that stupid boy's face again. Inga slapped her on the back and grinned. "I'm more interested in what's between his legs." Toril rolled her eyes and sank her oar into the water. The pull of the waves was getting stronger and she struggled to find a rhythm. Others in the company, Herlide and Orville, but others too, had already given up. They sat wrapped in great furs beside sheltered braziers, taking what little warmth they could. "Hubbard will tell us to stow away the oars soon. Then we will need to hold fast until the storm passes, or join Fritjof at the bottom of the sea." Toril shrugged. Hubbard was too shrewd a sailor to let a mere storm defeat him, but when one's time came, even the trickster himself would be hard put to evade his fate. She turned to the sea and watched as it rampaged and turned beneath grey clouds. For too long she had been away from the open waters, and her mood had dampened with each day they had moved inland. Now that she was back, cold as she was, wet as she felt her spirits soar. Her eyes narrowed as a wave rose up beside Varúlfr. It drew the ship towards it, until they were tilted horizontally against it, and a gauzy mist of water splashed over them. Hubbard rode the wave expertly, bringing the longship over it before it could crest and plummet them all to their doom. As the wave diminished beneath them, Toril thought she saw a flash of silver below the surface, the scales of an enormous shape riding alongside them, but when she blinked again, it was gone.
Land!
She shook free the vision and looked up as the call rang out again. What land is here? Inga rose from her seat beside her, stepping up onto it in an effort to see over the heads of the rest of the company.
There is nothing,
Ulfgar said from the seat opposite them. He ran a hand over his stubbly head and shrugged.
Not for many days still. There must be a mistake.
There is something. Inga leaned on Toral's shoulder for support and rose on her toes for a better look. I see a thin line, barely a smudge, but it has the look of land about it.
To your oars!
Halvor's voice boomed above the storm. He strode between the aisle, pulling the crew back down to their seats.
We make for the shore, and a break from the storm!
Inga plopped back down beside her and laid her hands on the oar. Together, they pulled deep against the chopping waters for the smudge on the horizon. The howling wind relented as they navigated their way into a sheltered cove, where the ocean was strangely dead and still. The land around them was unfamiliar, and Toril felt herself tense as she stared up at the grey crags above. Where had they come from? She had never seen this place before, and the maps did not speak of it. Unless the storm had blown them further off course than she realised. Halvor had them moor Varúlfr along the coast, and then set a team to repair what little damage the storm had done. Toril took up her sword and shield and walked along the beach with Inga, while the rest set up camp. She could see Halvor's pathfinders moving up ahead of them, slipping in and out of the trees that hemmed in the shoreline. Maybe they will find us another farmstead. Inga thumped her sword against her shield and smiled. Or perhaps a little lord and his castle, too far from anyone to call for help. That would be enough to settle my debt with Dag, no? Toril stayed quiet. Her own debts had been covered weeks ago, and she did not have it in mind to raid again. Inga stared at her from out of the corner of her eye, and then bumped into her with her shield. You were never smiling. Even when things are good. Troubled Toril. That is what they should call you in the songs. Only because that hole in your face never closes. Inga laughed loud and skipped about her, kicking up clumps of sand. Troubled Toril is his daughter did not smile. Troubled Toril, cold as Jotun with rage like Freya. Toril dropped her sword and shield and covered her ears. You sing like a dog, Inga. If the gods could hear you now, they'd cut out your tongue. Good enough for the beer halls, but not for troubled Toril, eh? Inga made to push her again, but Toril raised a hand. It's Bjarki, said Inga, following her gaze. Halvor's chief pathfinder was bounding over the beach towards them, his sword and shield strapped to his back. What have you found? Bjarki slowed, breathing heavily.
Kveldefur. We found her. She's up ahead.
See, I told you. Fritjof is too much of a coward to lose his ship. He will be sitting fat on Halvor's loot, like Hredmor and his dwarfs. Inga knitted her brow, her eyes still tracking the pathfinder as he jogged over the sand. And of the crew? Are they all there? Bjarki shrugged as he picked up his pace, heading towards the camp.
There is no one.
Halvor's company, over 20 warriors all told, stood at the top of a dune and stared down at Varúlfr's sister ship. Fritjof had moored her on the beach, away from the draw of the tide. Her oars had been stowed away and sails furled, but there was no sign of life anywhere aboard. Bjarki and his trackers stood by Halvor, engaged in whispered conversation, while the rest of the party edged down towards the ship. Do you think an ambush? Inga's question lacked any conviction, but Toril shook her head anyway. She couldn't see any of the signs of a fight from the dune. No bodies littered the sand, and there wasn't a drop of blood to be found around Kveldefur. They must have moved inland. She waved her shield towards the dense forest beside them, and then squinted into the gloom herself. A coarse thicket covered the land between the beach and the rock face that loomed above. The trees were tightly packed, leaving hardly enough space for a man and his shield to pass through, and malformed roots snaked their way across the forest floor. Fool that he was, it was unlike Fritjof to leave his ship unguarded. And for what? A walk through parts unknown? A shout from aboard the boat saw Toral's eyes snap back to Kveldafjör. Uber and Katja, two of Halvor's senior-blooded warriors, had clambered up the rungs of the ship and were waving everyone closer. The pair of them were covering their faces, and Uber retched up something watery before climbing back down. I do not like this. The two navigated the steep incline together, slipping and sliding as they made their way onto even ground. They were among the first to reach the bottom of the rise, and they pushed their way towards Halvor and his trackers, who had moved down ahead. Ulfgar gave them a curt nod and shifted up to let them through. He was normally the first to crack a smile, but his face was grim.
Might have been better we remained away from this bay.
He gritted his teeth and turned to look at the sea. Beyond the shelter of the cove, the storm still raged and the wind still howled. But beneath the crags of this new island, everything was peaceful.
I am reminded of the tales of Nostoront in this place, of the cursed and the damned. The hall is woven of serpent spines. There, Nidhogg sucked corpses of the dead, and the wolf tore men on dead body shore.
Toril shivered. You were always one to set a mood.
It is not me.
The old warrior thumbed his hand, and then rolled his neck before meeting her eyes.
Old Uwe has felt it too. We were not meant to come.
Inge guffawed. Ove always feels something, but sometimes it's just the madness inside his own head.
Mock him if you like, but he has seen more than you can know, more than you can understand.
Inge shrugged at that, and they walked in silence for a moment, behind Halvor and the Pathfinders. Ulfgar took such things seriously, more so than most. To argue with him was like pushing a ball through mud with its horns pointed at you. He bore his faith on his skin, and his shaven scalp was adorned with symbols of protection. Otala runes, the Fae, and tributes to Heimdall himself. Inge was about to snap back with a delayed retort when she gagged. That smell! Toril made a face and covered her nose with her forearm. Like rotten fish. Her eyes started to water at the stench that assaulted her senses, but she walked forward gamely, even as others choked and swore behind her. The rest of the party gathered at the base of the longship and waited as Bjarki and Ulfgar clambered up the rungs and stared over the side. They've left their shields. Toril glanced up at the rack, which remained untouched. That's Aix, said Inge, pointing her sword towards a red and white shield above them. They must have needed to move quickly. Toril nodded, but she felt the first hint of uneasiness grip her as she watched Bjarki and Ulfgar turn to face the gathered party.
It is a serpent's brood,
Bjarki stated solemnly. He made the sign of the Fae and spat at the boat.
This is Jörmungandr's lot, and we are not welcome in this place.
Ulfgar dropped down onto the sand and then helped the older warrior down.
It is an ill omen,
he said, once Bjarki was on the beach beside him. A crowd of confused faces stared back at him, until Halvor strode forward and nimbly clambered up the side of the boat.
Eels,
he said simply, as he stared down at the hold.
The storm must have seen them dumped in Fritjof's boat. Nothing more.
Ulfgar mumbled something from below, but Halvor silenced him with a wave of his hand.
There is nothing of the Midgard serpent here. Do you think we would have found this ship if the world snake had come upon it?
Ulfgar shrugged and thumbed his palm nervously.
I simply say what I see.
The Jarl shook his head and then stared at the party for a moment, sweeping his gaze across the dunes.
Fritjof is a fool. We all know this.
Some of the men chuckled at his words, but most were quiet. Ulfgar had put them on edge.
He has left his ship unguarded and charged off to see what treasures he can find for himself. He means to leave us with his ship like a nursemaid.
Halvor jumped down from the boat and dusted his hands off.
But we are not his nursemaids, are we?
Toril found herself muttering her dissatisfaction with the idea, along with the rest of the party.
We will move inland and find the fool. Then he can make a bed from the eels he left in his boat.
A grin split Halvor's face as the mood lifted, and raucous laughter was joined by his warriors.
Come now. Fritjof can't have made it far.
He nodded to his pathfinders, who moved off quickly into the forest.
There is still a little light before nightfall.
As the company moved towards the tree line, Inga pushed past Toril and headed towards the boat. What are you doing? Toril sighed and followed after her friend. You heard Halvor. We don't have much light left. I want to see. Inga dropped her gear into the sand and turned to Toril. Are you not curious to see what Jormungandr has left us? She didn't wait for an answer before pulling herself up the side of the boat. Toril sighed again and dropped her own gear to climb onto Kveldefjord. The wood had started to rot, and the smell of decaying flesh intensified as she pulled herself up. Inga exhaled as she reached the top and stared down into the hold. Gods, Bjarki was right. What is it, Inga? She didn't wait for a reply before peering down herself. The entire floor of Kveldefjord was covered in a writhing, seething mass of serpentine bodies. Their silver forms shifted in the half-light, wrapping themselves around one another in a slippery embrace. Toril nearly gagged at the sight of them, and turned away as the smell threatened to overpower her. There are so many! Inga curled her lips in disgust and watched as the creatures rolled across the floor of the boat. Fritjof and his company will have much to clean once this lot rots in the sun. They will have no help from me. She took one last look at the flowing mass of bodies, and then clambered back down the rungs. Come, Inga, or we will be left behind. The living and the dead. Of Halvor's company, 4 were left to guard over Varúlfr, and another 2 to wait by Fritjof's ship in case of his return. The rest set out into the dark forest, with torches lit against the coming of night.
I have not seen nor heard any sign of beast or bird in this place.
Ulfgar swatted away a gnat with his torch.
Only these bastards.
Your blood is too pure, said Inga, but I have the cure. She swigged from her flask and handed it to Toril. They will not eat you if your blood is poison. Toril shrugged and took a sip, almost spluttering as the bitter liquid went down her throat. What is this? She asked, wiping her mouth with her hand, then looking at the flask skeptically. Bart gave it to me as a gift before we left. It was all he had left from his journey east. No wonder his mind is so addled. Toril sniffed at the container and made a face. I would rather be eaten, I think. Suit yourself, but don't cry to me when your skin is raw from scratching. Ulfgar snorted.
Inga the Generous.
It is Inga the Bloodied, now that I have fought the Christians and stolen their silver. She adjusted the shield on her arm and stared up into the canopy. They had walked for many miles beneath the outstretched limbs of ancient trees, and there had been no sign of Fritjof or his company. Not long after leaving the shore, Bjarki had found a single path that cut its way through the forest. It was the only way past the near-impenetrable undergrowth, and Halvor led them on it towards the great crags they'd seen from the boats. There are no stars. Inga frowned up at the branches, and then shook her head. They hide from this place. They're hidden behind clouds, said Thoril. She'd felt uneasy since finding Kveldefjord and its slippery cargo, and didn't need Inga's superstitions compounding that. There was a storm, remember?
Or is it that this place is outside of our own?
Ulfgar glanced around him, holding his torch close to the trees. Their boughs and roots were scarred with age, and the leaves seemed to shrink away so close to the open flame.
Beneath the roots of the World Tree, there exists a place of terrible suffering. It is Hell's kingdom.
Toril rolled her eyes. But we have not died, Ulfgar. Ove is getting into your head with his stories. Unless you think we sunk to the bottom of the sea in that storm. The warrior shrugged.
Who's to say that we didn't?
Our flesh! Toril pulled down her sleeve and pointed to her bare skin. "Our sweat and thirst! Do you think the dead suffer these things?" Ulfgar flinched at the tone of her voice and raised a hand in supplication.
It is only a thought. I don't mean to anger you, Storm Maiden.
"It is not you, Ulfgar." Toril took a deep breath and rolled her knuckles against her shield. "I'm sorry. It is this place. The quietness is getting to me,"
It gets under my skin too,
said Ulfgar.
when these bastards aren't busy eating me.
He swung his torch at a cloud of insects and then beckoned to the other shield maiden.
I'll try some of your poison now, I think.
Inga grinned and handed him the flask. "It gets better after the first sip. Promise." Ulfgar raised a skeptical brow and took a hesitant sip. His face paled and his brow creased as the liquor passed his lips.
This is what Bart calls a drink?
He spat on the forest floor and groaned.
No wonder he always stinks of cat piss.
Inga grinned and took back the flask. "It has kept me warm through many a cold night, and it's better than being eaten alive,"
That it is,
said Ulfgar, pressing on ahead. He waved an arm towards the thinning trees as a pale moon emerged from behind the diminishing canopy.
It looks like this dark forest has finally come to an end. Now we will see what wolfish murderers and serpent spines haunt this island.
The forest opened up into a wide valley nestled between steep, windswept hills. A thin strip of silver hinted at the existence of a river not far ahead. Its snaking path ran the length of the valley and then disappeared beyond the grey walls of the mountain range in the distance. Halvor ordered the company forward, beyond the shelter of the forest, towards the river. The warriors were relieved to find themselves with empty skies above their heads once more, and moved with purpose. As they moved out from the undergrowth, Toril couldn't help but notice the lack of stars. Even without the cover of clouds, the sky was like a black sheet, with only the one light of the moon guiding their way.
We will camp by the river!
Halvor led the company himself, setting a grueling pace that soon saw them all wet with sweat and breathing heavily. He waved his axe at his chief scout and motioned to the grey peaks.
Björki and Sigert will move into the mountains while we rest.
He turned to his warriors, walking backward as he took them all in.
Do not sip too heavily on your mead this night. I think we will all need to be sharp come the morning.
His warriors grumbled to themselves, but accepted his warning without rebuke. Most were too tired for thoughts of drink, and the idea of a proper night's sleep was enough to keep them motivated. Inga had gone off to see if she could not join Bjarki and his scouts, and Toril found herself walking between Ove and Ulfgar. The moon had not yet reached its zenith, and its pale light made everything look a shade of grey.
There is no sign of that fool or his company. No tracks, no fires, nothing of our friends. Halvor leads us on a merry chase.
He spat at the ground and shook his head.
This place is empty.
Ove snorted from beneath his hood.
It is not empty, Ulfgar. You are just blind to what occupies this land.
He waved a hand at the mountains before them and smiled.
We walk where few have walked before, in the place between the living and the dead.
It was Toril's turn to snort now. Old Ove, you have seen so much, and yet your stories are always the same. The living and the dead, the beasts of Nastrond, the serpent that eats the world. Why have we seen none of these things? Every year you cry your tale, and every year we ship back home alive and richer than before.
I only repeat what I have seen, girl.
Ove made the sign of the Fae with a gnarled hand, and then turned to look at her. His skin was weathered by years of salt and sun, but his blue eyes were as piercing as ever. He stared at her for a moment, and then smiled.
You have seen something too, I think.
Toril shrugged, but in her mind's eye she recalled that flicker of silver beneath the waves, that formless shape slipping through the sea.
It is no blessing to have hold of the sight. To see one's future played out before one's very eyes has damned many a man to insanity. But you must be better than that.
What is it you saw?
It was nothing. She shook her head, readjusting her shield on her arm. Orphe is mad. You know that as well as I.
I have seen it too, girl. It is the world's end that slithers behind your eyes.
He retched out a hacking cough and laughed.
Do not be afraid. Soon they will all see.
Toril snarled at the old warrior and picked up her pace, leaving the pair of them behind. It was only when she was at the head of the company and Ove's choking laughter had faded away that she felt her mind settle. He is mad, she thought to herself. Him and Bjarki both. Still, there was something in the way he had looked at her that made her think otherwise. The old man had seen more years than any of them, and his words, though often veiled by myth, were rarely false. She sighed to herself and tightened her grip on her shield. Either way, she would meet her fate head-on. The first night on the island was cold, and Halvor ordered massive fires to fend off the chill. He cared not that someone might see them. After all, who would dare attack Halvor and his company of bloodied? The warriors drew lots for sentry duty, and those that could tried to slip in a few hours' sleep before dawn. Toril and the other shield maiden had laid their kit out beside one of the bonfires and sipped from Inger's bitter liquor while Ove told stories of the night and of the first fires.
When Loke, Odin and Heinir crossed the vast mountains, they came across a herd of oxen.
The old warrior took a bite from his dried meat and crinkled his nose.
Fresh meat, not like what we've been nibbling on, eh, Ulfgar?
Ulfgar blinked into wakefulness at the sound of his name and stared across the fire at the old warrior.
What now?
Come, come! Inger rolled across the grass and extended her flask towards him. Don't be boring, Ulfgar. Sit with us. He shook his shaven head and pulled his blanket tighter about his chest.
I have the next watch. It would look poor for me if Halvor caught me drunk. You heard what he said.
She stuck out her tongue and took a steady draught from the bottle. You will be sad when there is none left. He shrugged and closed his eyes.
As long as I get my sleep, I do not care.
What about you, Ove? Inger turned to the veteran. Something to fend off the cold and make your heart kick like a newborn's.
I already see things that are not there. I rather not tempt fate with your fire water.
More for me and Toril, then. She took another sip from her flask and squinted into the darkness surrounding the camp. The mountains were mere silhouettes in the distance, looming over the sides of the valley like the bastions of some great castle. The river they'd seen from afar was, in fact, two concurrent streams racing beside one another towards the sea. They'd bathed in its water and even fished, but there was no life to be found in it, and the warriors had made do with dried meats once more. For a moment, she thought she spotted a movement on the ridge above their camp, a single figure stepping into the moonlight. She squinted up at the hill, trying to bring it into focus, but whatever it was she'd seen had gone.
You're right, girl.
Ove cocked his head, a strange look on his face. It's nothing, said Inger, shaking her head, and then bringing her eyes back down to the fire. It's only shadows.
Is it nothing, or is it shadows?
Ove showed his teeth before winking at Inger.
They are not the same.
The shield maiden rolled her eyes and leaned back on her bedroll. She was tired of Ove and his riddles. It was both and neither. He could figure that one out for himself. She closed her eyes and let the warmth of the fire and the soft hum of her friend's chatter lull her to sleep. In the morning, Ulfgar was gone. Bjarki shook his head as he walked over to Toril and the others.
There is no sign of him. Sigurd saw him take the watch, but after that, he did not return.
Where did he stand sentry? Toril had been the first to wake and to find his bedroll empty.
Not far from here.
He pointed to the base of the ridge on the other side of the river.
He took over from Eva and left camp well after midnight. His watch was to end a few hours before dawn, but no one has seen him.
He can't have gotten far. But why would he have left us in the first place? Toril licked her lips and followed Inga's gaze. The drink had given her a splitting headache, and she was finding it hard to concentrate. It makes no sense, she concluded.
I am inclined to agree.
Halvor stood next to Bjarki and nodded to them each in turn. His mane of hair was wet from the river, and his beard had grown out. Flecks of white and grey dotted the scruff, making him appear even more distinguished.
It is not like Ulfgar to disappear like this.
Thin lines creased his forehead as he frowned.
I suspect he has been taken by whoever has been tracking us this last day.
Toril and Inga's immediate questions were ignored, and Halvor silenced them with a wave of his hand.
Bjarki spotted them when we landed. A small band, maybe 3 or 4 in total. They have been shadowing us since we moved inland, but I had not expected them to act so boldly, not against our numbers.
Inga shivered, remembering the silhouette she'd seen on the ridge. Who are they?
I cannot be sure. Locals, perhaps. Or other folk like us who've been washed up by the storm. The pathfinders have been instructed to catch one of them if possible. Then we will see.
And what of Ulfgar? Toril's eyes narrowed as she watched her Jarl. She already suspected the answer.
There is nothing that can be done. We don't know the land, and Bjarki says the surrounds turn into more gullies and ravines than he can count. Too many places to disappear. We will find what has happened to him when we catch one of his captors.
Toril nodded. She knew Halvor did not allow for dissent. What was done, and she'd just have to hope Bjarki and his trackers were as good as they thought they were.
None of this to the others.
Halvor met her eyes, and then stared down Inga and Ove.
I would not have fears of shadow men spread through the company. They will learn of this when the time is right.
We will keep your secret, Iron Son.
Ove smiled.
But do not think to catch these spectres or to harm them. They cannot be hurt. They walk between the worlds. This I know. Ulfgar knows it too.
We will see, old man. There is little that walks in this world that does not fear the sharp end of my axe.
They walked for half a day before someone spotted smoke rising behind them, and Halvor called them to a halt. He signalled to Sigurd and those scouts not out searching for Ulfgar and his mysterious captors. They quickly moved up the ridge to get an eye on where the smoke was coming from. Could be Fritjof and his lot, said Inga. She dropped her kit on the ground and placed a foot on one of the larger rocks around them. The valley had started to narrow as they closed in on the crags, and rocky debris littered the floor around them.
Could be.
Ove sucked on his teeth and tracked the scouts up the hill.
Could be a funeral pyre.
Best not to wonder on such things until we can be sure. Toril shielded her eyes from the sun with a hand and stared at the rising plumes of black smoke. There is another. It is smaller, but it is the same. Inga clambered atop the rock and leaned against Toril as she tried to get a better look. She's right. There is more smoke from somewhere further back.
We will find out just now,
said Ove, gesturing to the ridge. Halvor's scouts were racing down the incline, trying their best to remain sure-footed as they hurtled down towards them.
It's the boats!
The cry went up like wildfire, and Toril felt a familiar feeling of uncertainty crowd out her other thoughts. We are trapped here, she thought, as she joined the milling mass of Norsemen crowding around Halvor.
It is true. Our ships have been set afire. Both Varúlfr and Fritjof's ship, though it does not look like the fire on Kveldafur has taken so well. She may still be salvageable.
What are we to do?
A voice called from the amassed warriors. Toril could see the company was close to panic. Tired men and women, stranded far from home on an island they'd never seen before. It would not take much to push them over the edge. To his credit, Halvor did not seem perturbed by the situation. He rolled his shoulders and turned to Sigurd. The two engaged in quiet conversation, both of them glancing up at the clouds of smoke in the distance, before Halvor raised a hand to silence the company.
We have no choice but to return to the ships and to see what we can salvage from the fires.
He nodded to Sigurd, who moved to gather the remaining pathfinders.
We will wait for Bjarki's return, and then we shall make with haste for the coast.
And the Fritjof? It was Inger's voice that Toril heard. She turned to see the other shield maidens standing beside two of Halvor's largest warriors, Theodoric and Henrik. What happens to Fritjof and his company? And what of Ulfgar? Are we to leave them here, to this island and its people? Halvor gave her a look of warning, and then rolled the handle of his axe with his wrists.
There is nothing that can be done. We must look to our own preservation now.
His words were met with agreement by the gathered company, but Inger was not yet done. If it were you, we would stay until we found you, or we were all dead. Halvor smiled, revealing a row of straight white teeth.
But it is not me, shield maiden, and I say we go.
Before Inger could continue her protest, Halvor whistled and waved at the remaining pathfinders.
You have until nightfall, and then we are gone.
Inger gritted her teeth, but looked up at Toril's approach. Just like that. Maybe Bjarki will find something, perhaps of Ulfgar or Fritjof, or both. Inger shook her head and wiped at her eyes. She was tired and she was hungover, and she wanted to see her friends again. It might already be too late. There is something wrong about this place. There is no life here, not even a bird, just these pests that want to drain us of our blood. She swiped at the air as if to make her point. Halvor must know it. If we leave now, we may seal their fates. Toril nodded, but there was nothing more she could say. Halvor had spoken, and his word was law. Night had long since fallen when the first of Bjarki's scouts returned. Tired-eyed and weary-limbed, they slowly streamed in. They spoke of a great ravine guarded by the walls of ancient pillars, of figures cut from stone, and strange sounds in the trees. They spoke of an uneasiness that settled upon them, and a feeling of being watched, of being stalked, hunted. But of Fritjof and Ulfgar there was no sign.
We wait on Bjarki. When he returns, we will make for the coast, for our ships.
They waited until the night grew cold, when even fire barely kept the chill from their bones. The camp sat in a state of frozen anticipation, with each warrior ready to move at a moment's notice. But that notice never came. Halvor grew restless and took to pacing around the perimeter, harassing his sentries and forcing them to take deeper forays into the night, to search for the pathfinder. It wasn't long before Toril and Inger were sent out with a party, into the black of night, with only their torches to guide them. We will find nothing like this, stomping around in the night like fools, hoping to fall upon Bjarki by luck. Toril lifted the torch above her head and watched the flickering shadows around them. They had been walking for hours now, with still no sign of the pathfinder. What hope she'd had of finding him had diminished, and she just wanted to return to the camp and to the warmth of the fires. She sighed as she stared up at the hills that loomed above them. The peaks were hidden by the night, and what little light the moon shone down on them failed to illuminate the darkest corners of the valley. What else would you have us do? Toril lowered her torch. You heard Halvor. We must look to ourselves now. If we don't find Bjarki, we have to leave without him. Inga shook her head. Halvor will not leave his precious pathfinder behind. Then we must do as he says and search every crevice of this valley before dawn. The other shield maiden rubbed a hand over her scalp. She had not shaved it in weeks, and stubble now covered the tattoos that spiraled across her head. Ulfe has taken it well. Ulfgar is like a son to him. Toril took a swig from her flask and wiped her mouth. He said he knew what was coming. Him and Ulfgar both. How could they know? You know what they are like. Toril turned to her friend and waved at the sky. The gods tell them stories, or plant ideas in their heads. At least that is what Ulfe wants us to think. It is either true, or he is mad. Sometimes I think it is both. They walked in silence for a moment, keeping within hailing distance of the rest of the party. Arvid and Dagfinn were barely a dozen yards from them, while Uskar and Tommen ranged ahead, their torches appearing like mini stars in the distance. But of course, there were no stars here. Toril hadn't seen one since they'd arrived. She looked up at the sky, careful to keep her footing on the uneven rocks that surrounded the gully. It is like Ove says. Inga came to a standstill beside her. This island is of another place. They were still standing together, staring at the emptiness above them, when Uskar's horn rung out in the darkness. It blew once, then twice, and then there was silence. He's found something, said Toril as she skipped down from the rocks. More torches were moving through the valley now, heading towards where Uskar's horn had sounded from. If it's Ulfgar, I'll box his nose in for leading us on this merry chase. Inga's face shone with hope, and she jogged ahead of Toril towards the gathering torches. Then we will see if Ulfe saw that coming too. Toril smiled at the thought and picked up her pace. The destroying flame. There were no smiling faces to greet them when they reached Uskar. A band of Norsemen stood around 3 indistinct bodies, bound and gagged with rope.
It is the Christians,
said Tommen at their approach. His eyes were wide and a sheen of sweat covered his upper lip. The other warriors looked similarly spooked and fidgeted with their blades as they waited. How is this possible? Toril stared down at her own slave, who'd been left back on their longship when the company moved inland. The man's greasy black hair hung over eyes that flickered back and forth across the gathered warriors. His beard was covered in spittle where the gag was loose, and welts had already formed upon his hands.
It is a trick,
said Sigurd, stepping towards the slaves.
Fritjof is playing with us. It is one of his games.
His words were met with silence, and Toril found herself thumbing her own sword nervously. How had they gotten ahead of them? Who had left them out here to be found? She knelt down beside her slave and gripped his jaw with a hand. The man bit harder into his gag, and his eyes darted inside his skull, averting her gaze. What happened to you? Even if he could understand her, she doubted he would have responded. Something had scared him, and the other slaves too. She rose from the floor and nodded to Sigurd. Let's get them back to camp. See if Ove can make sense of what's happened here. He spent more time with the Christians than any of us. Sigurd pulled the nearest slave to his feet and prodded him forward. The wiry blonde man gargled from behind his gag, but stumbled forward without resisting.
Where are their guards?
He yanked the man by the collar and drew him close.
Where are the others?
Spit sprayed from his mouth and his face reddened. The Christian tried to make himself small, cowering away from the massive Norseman, but his grip was too tight. Toril placed a hand on the warrior's shoulder and shook her head. It is no use, Sigurd. They cannot speak our tongue. All they know is our rage and the sharpness of our blades.
You are right. They are a weak people, made weaker by their god who dies.
He kicked at the slave lazily with his foot and then strode forward in the direction of camp. Ulfe will know what to do. Inger helped Toril guide her slave forward. The man was surprisingly strong beneath his rags, and Toril felt the bulge of muscle on his arms as she directed him back towards the camp. It was his eyes that held her, though. They rolled madly in his head and did not stop, not even when they'd reached the safety of the encampment.
It is useless. I cannot make sense of anything they say.
The slaves had had their gags removed, though their hands were still securely bound, and were sitting in the centre of the camp. Ove circled them slowly, nodding and shaking his head as he asked them question after question in their native tongue. The responses were hurried and garbled, though the Bretlander tongue always sounded that way to Toril.
Ask them how they found themselves inland.
Halvor's voice boomed above the confused chattering of the Christians.
Was it Fritjof? Is this some game he is playing with us?
Ove translated the words and then waited as the leanest of the three replied. After a moment, the veteran turned to Halvor and shrugged.
He says they came through the earth.
What foolishness is this?
Halvor stopped his pacing and turned to the captives. His axe rested in the crook of his arm, and his eyes shone red in the firelight.
Do they mock me, Uwe?
The old man raised a brow and met the Jarl's stare.
I think, given their position, they would not dare, Ironson.
Halvor glanced at the slaves. His eyes narrowed into slits. Then he spat at the fire.
Find out what happened here, Uwe. And no more of these stories. I will have the truth.
I will do what I can, but I am not familiar with all of their language. There are words that do not make sense to me.
See that it is done.
Halvor spared one last look at the captives, and then stormed off into the night. Once the Jarl was gone, Toril sat down beside Ove and watched as the slaves chattered amongst themselves. Much of their panic seemed to have receded, but they still flinched when she arrived.
They are scared.
Ove scratched his nose with a thumb and looked to Toril.
They were asleep on the ship and woke up to screaming. Probably Erluf and his men.
What then?
I am not sure. The language they speak is strange, littered with metaphor, so I cannot quite tell what is true and what is an allusion to fact. Why they were spared, I cannot tell, but it has something to do with the blood of their three-faced god. It is not pure, or it is too pure, I do not know.
What of Elof and the others guarding Varúlfr?
Nothing, only their screams.
Toril frowned at the old warrior. He was right. It sounded nothing more than the mutterings of madmen. Hardly enough to satisfy Halvor or the others. Did you not see this? In your dreams?
There was nothing of the Christians, nor of the burning ships.
Ove turned his hands over, mapping the scars on his knuckles with a finger.
This place blinds me to our fate. I only see fragments, but it is not enough. It is worse with the Christians. What I do see is blurred, as if from a great distance.
Toril leaned back, resting on her hands. What are we to do? No Fritjof, no Ulfgar, and now no Bjarki.
Halvor will want us to stay. He owes Bjarki a debt of blood, and will not leave this place without him, even if it means he risks us all.
That night, they caught their first glimpse of the strange people who had been tracking them. Sigurd saw them first, standing upon the ridge above them, but then more were spotted, until the hills seemed filled by their presence. Dozens of figures moved silently across the forsaken landscape, torches raised to the starless sky. Halvor ordered the company to battle readiness, but the observers seemed uninterested in an open fight.
I do not see a blade among them,
said Sigurd as he strode between the massed ranks of Norsemen.
Catch one alive if they come at us.
But the onlookers seemed content to simply watch from a distance. They moved away if any of Halvor's party got too close, only to reappear further along a moment later. The warriors grew frustrated, and some of them lobbed stones at the figures, to little effect. They are testing us. Toril moved up beside Inga and Ove, taking her place in the shield wall, probing for weakness, or trying to bait us into chasing after them. It might work, said Inga. She nodded to a band of younger warriors at the foot of the hills. The men were slowly hyping themselves up, and only the appearance of some of the company's veterans stopped them from racing headlong at the watchers. Ove lowered his shield and rubbed his eyes with an arm.
They are young and foolish, but we were all like that once. Halvor will see them in line.
His words were soon followed by the hoarse bark of the Jarl, and the offending warriors quickly fell back into place.
You see,
said Ove, staring back up the walls of the valley.
Not even youthful vigor ignores the will of the Jarl.
He squinted into the darkness and blinked before turning to Toril and Inga.
I fear we will need his strength before long, both of his mind and his axe.
The three stood together until the early hours, watching the watchers. It was only when the sun rose and the figures retreated into the many caverns and ravines that splintered off from the valley that the band finally found rest. That morning, they found Frithjof and the crew of Kafjaldufur. Their bodies, over 30 of them, had been nailed to stakes and hung rotting beneath the sun. The forest of corpses was found by one of Bjarki's pathfinders, upon the ridge nearest the grey walls of the ravine. Halvor had led the party up the hill as soon as he'd heard the news. Swarms of gnats clung to the dead in such numbers that it was impossible to make out the features of the deceased. By the smell, it was clear that they had been here for some time. Longer, perhaps, than was possible.
We must burn them,
Halvor declared.
This is no way for a Viking to enter Valhalla.
He pointed towards the thin line of trees that ringed the hill.
A mighty pyre for the fallen, to usher their spirits on to the next life. Then we will deal with those who dared take up swords against our brothers.
The Norsemen took to the task with vigour, while others set to removing the crew of their sister ship from the wooden stakes. It was a gruesome task, and Toril found herself retching as she cut the bonds holding an elderly warrior to the post. Removing the nails from his wrists proved to be more horrid, and she was forced to step away from the corpse for a moment.
They will thank you for it,
said Ove, walking towards her.
Once they find rest in the great halls of our fathers.
Toril nodded and wiped her brow. Braziers had been lit alongside the dead, and the smoke fended off the worst of the insects, but the heat wasn't helping with the smell.
If we had not come upon them, the dead might have returned.
Ove drew a blade from the folds of his sleeves and approached the stake.
To leave a body like this, with the head towards the heavens, is to encourage the becoming of Draugr. You can see here.
He tapped the swollen leg of the corpse with a knife.
Even now, the corruption has begun. These bodies will soon welcome unlife, and then we will have to kill our brothers and sisters, even if it is no longer truly them.
He shook his head sadly and began the grisly task of removing the nails from the warrior's hands and feet. Toril watched quietly, and then helped Ove take the body down and place it on the floor beside the others. Behind them, the pyre had grown and now covered much of the surface of the hill.
They will see this fire from Tronda.
Ove smiled sadly and patted her shoulder.
And when we return home, we shall feast to the memory of those we lost here.
Toril wiped her hands on her breeches and stared down the line of posts. Any sign of Bjarki or Ulfgar amongst the dead?
Inga searches now for them, but she will not find them here, I think.
She looked quizzically at the old warrior, but Ove simply shrugged.
This is not the fate reserved for Ulfgar. As for Bjarki, I suspect he would not let his body be caught like this, not by whoever haunts these hills.
You think he is still out there?
It is what the Jarl believes, and if anyone can hide himself away in a place like this, it's Bjarki.
Then why not return to us if he is still alive and free?
I do not have all the answers, girl. And in this place, I can see as much as you. It is just a feeling, that is all. Perhaps Inga will come upon their bodies both, and then we can mourn their passing with the rest of them. But until then, I sense there is more to come for both Bjarki and Ulfgar.
Halvor will want us to continue on, won't he?
He will not let this go unpunished, and he will not leave Bjarki to suffer the same fate.
Ove raised a hand and gestured to the bodies still bound to the poles.
There must be a bloodening now, and vengeance for our fallen. Halvor will bring violence to those who have done this.
Toril nodded and watched as another body was removed from its stake. Good. Vengeance it shall be. They watched from the hills as the pyre was lit, and great plumes of smoke blew across the valley, aiding the dead in their journey beyond. It was Inga that first recited the words of Hjalmar's song. She had found Aix's body with the rest of them, and the words rung out cold from her mouth. Flies from the south, the famished raven, fly with himself the fallow eagle. On the flesh of the fallen, I shall feed them no more. On my body both will batten now. The sad notes of a tagle harper joined her voice, and then the soft rhythmic beat of a drum too. Toril watched as the flames roared across the hastily built pyre, and felt her heart go hard at the thought of her fallen raid mates. To survive the sword of the Bretons and Njord's angry seas, only to be slaughtered on a strange island far from home. She scowled. Ove's predictions be damned. She would see her kin avenged, and she would see Tronda again. When the last note of Hjalmar's song faded, the company put the funeral pyre behind them and set off towards the mountain pass. Sigurd made sure there was always a sword and shield between Halvor and the empty hills, but the Jarl ignored his mothering and moved speedily to the front of the band. The remaining pathfinders fanned out, occupying both the high and low ground surrounding the Norsemen. They would not be caught out by those who had butchered Fritjof and his crew. It was some time after noon that one of the scouts returned, in a state of nervous excitement. He was quickly taken aside by Halvor, who questioned him intensely before being sent back out into the hills. Something is afoot. Inga shifted her shield over her shoulder and watched as the pathfinder disappeared up a rocky outcrop. Halvor signalled to a band of veterans and soon had them following in the scouts' footsteps. The warriors were less light of step, and smaller rocks and stones rolled down the side of the hill, causing a groan from the disgruntled warriors closest. When the scout returned, with his escort of veterans in tow, he was carrying a small object in his hands. Toril tried to get a proper look at it, but whatever it was lay hidden beneath a bundle of rags. "Let's see what he's found," said Inga, pushing her way to the front of the company. Toril and Ove followed, ignoring the cursed complaints of the other Norsemen as they navigated through the press. Halvor was standing with Sigurd and Tommen, staring down into the bundle, a strange look on his face. The scout was talking rapidly into his ear, but it was clear that Halvor wasn't listening. He placed a hand into the rags and retrieved the object, lifting it above his head for all to see.
This is what we face in this God's forsaken place.
He spat at the ground and rotated his hand so all the gathered warriors could get a proper look.
Truly, it is a being cursed.
The Jarl's fingers were wrapped around the pale white surface of a skull. Though distinctly human, the shape was warped, and the cranium jutted out unevenly. The forehead was sloped and smooth, and elongated in a manner that seemed almost serpentine. Toril felt her stomach churn as she gazed into its empty sockets. Behind her, she heard the Christians praying frantically to their dying god, before they were forced into silence by their captors.
Behold the beast!
Halvor turned the skull in his hands and stared into its ever-smiling face, before letting it fall from his grasp.
And what awaits it?
He stomped a foot down hard, smashing the skull to pieces, and then rolled his shoulders.
Only the godless could do this to themselves. Only the godless could force their skulls to such a shape to mimic the unfit and deformed.
He sneered in disgust, then pointed at what remained of the white bones.
We will see the same thing repeated 1,000 times if needed.
With that, he turned his back on the company and strode towards the crags. The warriors followed him without hesitation, and 24 Norsemen jogged up the last hill before the opening of the ravine. But when they reached the summit, even Halvor was forced to take pause. A low muttering spread amongst the ranks as more of the company came into view of the grey walls of the mountain pass.
This I did not see. How did I not see this?
Before them, on either side of the mouth of the ravine, the rock walls had been cut and chiselled. 2 great carvings looked down upon them. Hewn from the surface of the rock itself, the shapes formed were almost as tall as the crag itself. The artist evidently had some skill, and the representations were almost lifelike. Toril felt her skin crawl as she gazed upon the first of the 2 carvings. On the left of the passage, a great snake stretched out across the length of the wall. Its coils were wrapped around a depiction of the mountain itself, while its angular head stared down on the entrance to the passage, its massive fangs exposed. The carver had somehow managed to create the impression of colour without its use, and Toril could almost see the silver scales of the beast beneath the sea once more. In contrast, the other engraving seemed more primitive. Rather than the smooth corners of the serpent's depiction, the angles used were all sharp and rough, at times obscuring parts of the carving entirely. Despite that, Toril could still make out most of the piece. It depicted a man sitting on his haunches, with his legs crossed. His one hand was raised, with 2 fingers extended to the heavens, while the other was pointed downward, towards the ground beneath his feet. As Toril got closer, she could just make out the poorly hewn shapes of more serpentine bodies wrapped around his own.
Eels,
said Ove as they approached. He was right. What she'd mistaken for snakes were, in fact, dozens of eels covering his skin like armour.
This is an old faith.
Ove made the mark of the Fae with his one hand and pulled his axe from his belt with the other. You have encountered these images before? Toril frowned at the veteran and then stared back up at the carvings as they walked beside them.
This one, yes.
Ove pointed to the man and his armour of eels.
But this...
He screwed up his eyes and stared at the snake.
I have not seen something like this before. Not even on my journeys to the land in the west.
Who is the man? The shield maiden stepped onto the sand that made up the floor of the ravine and helped Ove down from the rocky ledge beside her.
He is a figure from prehistory. Neruk, Elil, Nergal, the destroying flame. He has gone by many names and has had many worshippers. His time has passed, though, with the coming of the Christians and the worshippers of Allah.
The destroying flame. Toril clenched her jaw and took one last look at the carving of Neruk. His eyes seemed to follow her, and she felt she was being watched even when it was finally gone from sight. A shout from behind her stopped her in her tracks, and the whole company turned to see what had caused the commotion. Henrik and Ava were trying to pull the Christians into the ravine, but they had dug their heels in and wouldn't go any further. Toril saw her own slave pulling at Henrik, sheer panic in his eyes, while the others had fallen to their knees and were begging their captors not to force them to continue.
On your feet!
Henrik shouted. He smashed a meaty palm into her slave's face and dragged him through the sand. The others grabbed onto the Viking's legs, slowing him to a halt and giving her own slave enough time to get back to his feet.
They will kill them,
said Orvar, but Toril was already moving towards the huddle of bodies. Enough! She called as Henrik kicked his knee into the lanky Christian's face. The man sputtered blood and grabbed his nose as a moan erupted from his throat. She lifted her sword threateningly when Henrik caught her eyes. He is mine! She pointed her blade towards her slave and nodded. I will not have you kill him because he has slowed you down. He shrugged.
They will not go any further.
I will take him. If he does not come, then I will punish him as I see fit, with blade or fist, but it will be my blade or fist. Henrik shrugged again, but let go of her slave and took a step back.
Be it on you.
Toril nodded and grabbed the slave by his collar. Understanding seemed to have dawned on him, and he did not resist, knowing that his life was truly at risk. She prodded him forward with her shield and walked him back towards Orvar. What's gotten into them? Inga joined her as she guided her slave. She stank like spirits and smoke. I don't know. They are scared easily, these Christians. Orlin knows something we do not. Inga cackled and swigged deeply from her flask. Toril couldn't see where she'd place her sword or shield, but she wasn't in the mood for a fight. Her slave seemed to have calmed, and the other prisoners had followed after him, preferring to face their fears than face a beating from an angry Norseman. She watched him carefully as they walked through the opening to the ravine, and saw that he was talking softly to himself, reciting what seemed to be the same words over and over. He was at prayer, she realized. She glanced at the other Christians and saw that they were doing the same thing. She didn't know why, but it made a shiver run down her spine. Halvegan. The ravine opened up until there was enough space for the company to walk side by side without touching the walls. Halvor stayed at the front and sent roving bands of warriors forward, sometimes joining them himself. His voice became a near-constant feature as noon turned to late afternoon. He shouted reassurances and words of praise, of vengeance and anger. It was only when dusk fell and his voice grew hoarse that silence fell over the warriors. That skull, said Thoril, as Halvor called them to a halt for the day. How did it come to be shaped in such a way? Ove clicked his teeth and dropped his shield and bedroll to the ground.
It is through binding that such deformities occur. I have seen it once before, though not to such an extent. As an infant, the skull is bound with rope and cloth. The pressure forces the head to grow in such a way, or the child dies, one or the other.
Why would anyone do such a thing? Inga slumped down on the ground beside Toril and made a face. To risk death, only to be rewarded with deformity. It is madness. Ove stretched his back out and yawned.
It is beyond me. It was a long time ago that I last saw it, and the man I had seen was already dead, so he could not answer my questions.
Inga chuckled and rolled onto her side to stare at Toril. The Christians seemed troubled by it. Go on, ask yours what he fears. Toril turned her head to her slave and watched as he chewed on the dry meat she'd provided. The man's eyes met her own for a second, before he lowered his head and focused on his meagre dinner. Ask him, Ove. Toril rubbed her hands together and nodded to the old warrior. Maybe it will help us figure out where we find ourselves.
It is not so easy.
Ove frowned.
These Bretlanders speak in dialects I am not familiar with.
Try. Toril took a bite from her own supper and chewed it slowly, gesturing to Ove as she swallowed. Ove sighed and walked towards her slave, who ignored him until he felt a boot prod him gently in the side. The veteran knelt down on his haunches and started speaking in the Bretlander tongue, using his hands to articulate and emphasize points when communication seemed to break down. After a while, once the first fires had been built, Ove rose from his knees and wandered back over to them. And? Ove eased onto his haunches and palmed his hands.
Neruk, the old god, carved into the mountain. The Christians think he is someone else.
Inga rolled her eyes. Who do they say he is? Another god who dies?
Adir Melek, the blasphemer. I had not heard of him until now, but they believe he is a servant of the devil, and that this is the way to hell.
Servants of the devil, ancient gods, and the path to Nastront itself. Inga lay on her back. What are we to believe, Wolfe? Perhaps they are the same thing. Not you, too. Inga kicked dirt towards her and laughed. You are always the one telling Ofe and Ulfgar off for their stories. Troubled Toril. Now you believe them. I do not say that they are real, just that they represent the same thing. She crossed her legs and put her hands between them. The night air was bringing with it a chill, and smaller fires would soon be lit all around the camp. Inga rolled onto her stomach and stared out into the night. They had stopped where the ravine grew widest, and the towering walls were less imposing. Inga traced the movement of their scouts, following their torches as they moved alongside the edge of the ravine. Great shadows hung to the sides of the incline, and it was only when one of the torches grew closer to one that she saw it was not a shadow, but a gaping hole in the side of the rock. There were dozens of them, scattered all about the valley. She squinted against the darkness and watched as one of the torches disappeared down a tunnel, only to reappear moments later at another tunnel further along. This place is a never-ending maze. I will be glad to see it behind us, if we ever make it off this island. Toril nodded, but Ove remained quiet, deep in thought. He remained like that, even when the smaller fires were lit, even when Inga and Toril were wrapped up in their bedrolls, fast asleep. Wake up, Toril! Get up! Toril awoke with a jerk and instinctively went for her sword. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she saw Inga sitting over her, her eyes wide and a nervous look on her face. What is it? She wiped the sleep from her own eyes and rested on her elbows. Ove was nowhere to be seen, but the rest of the camp was being woken up by sentries and those who couldn't sleep. Listen. She listened. It was soft at first, barely a sound on the edge of hearing. But as she focused, it grew louder, until it was all she could hear. A low moan, punctuated by silence, carried itself across the camp, repeating itself over and over. What is that? She moved into a sitting position and stared into the night. At first I thought it was the wind echoing through those tunnels, but then it got clearer. Inga shifted until she was kneeling beside her and touched her arm with a hand. Toril, it is a person. Someone in great pain calling out. Where is Orfe? Toril dragged herself up from the ground, her tiredness forgotten. He is with Halvor. He thinks it might be Ulfgar, but who is to say? Inga joined her standing, and the two started walking towards the camp's perimeter. The rest of the company was wide awake by the time Halvor had planned on a course of action. His scouts had moved out the moment the voice on the wind made itself heard, and had identified one of the tunnels as the source. Sigurd and a band had already moved into the tunnel, and the rest of the company would follow.
It is Bjarki, or Ulfgar, or both.
The Jarl stood by the fire in the centre of the camp and stared into the gathered faces.
It does not matter. It is one of us, and we will not let his cries go unanswered.
The gathered Norsemen were in full battle gear, their shields held at the ready. Many of them had applied ochres and paints to their faces, and only their eyes shone out beneath blood-red visages.
Sigurd leads the vanguard. His veterans will mark a trail for us to follow. Then we will have our vengeance, and these vile beings will know that Halvor and his blooded have fallen upon them.
He raised his axe and let out a guttural howl, thumping his shield as the rest of the band joined him. Toril found herself howling with the rest of the party, and the weight of days fell from her shoulders. Finally, they would confront the enemy face to face. Finally, they would bring steel to flesh and release the frustration that had followed them since landing on the island. She would follow Halvor into the tunnels, and she would bloody her blade once more. She accepted the torch offered to her as she walked past the fire in Halvor's wake and moved into a jog beside Inga and Orve. The other shield maiden had a look of glee on her face. No doubt she was running through the same emotions she was. But Orve only smiled sadly when she glanced at him. He was too caught up in his stories, in his games of fate, and the will of the gods. The will of the gods was with them, and with their hero Halvor. How else could they perform such feats of strength and courage against the Bretlanders? How else could they survive the storms thrown at them? Even the Christians, with their miracles, could not compete with the chosen bloodied of Halvor. The entire company moved towards the tunnels, and Toril even saw the slaves being pushed along in the direction of the entrance. They would all bear witness to the whetting of her sword. She gripped her shield closer to her chest as the warriors were forced to press together. The tunnel entrance was narrower than it looked, and she smelt burnt hair as the Norsemen bunched up. The air grew hot, and sweat quickly soaked her undershirt. Beneath her feet, the rock was smooth, and she could feel a slight incline. They were heading underground. The tunnel grew wider the deeper they went, and soon there was enough space for the band to move unhindered by one another. Halvor waved the Norseman forward and took stock of his surrounds. The walls around them were smooth, as though the result of a current or stream. Small passages ran along the side of the main tunnel, but none of them were foolish enough to explore lest they lose the main party. Sigurd had been true to his word. Red paint stained the walls, marking out his path ever downward. The sound of suffering continued as they mapped out the tunnels, growing louder as they explored its depths. It wasn't long before Toril wanted to cover her ears or to scream loudly, anything to block out the noise. She could see the others were growing uncomfortable with it too, but with Halvor in the lead, they plodded on regardless. By the time the tunnel ended, becoming one great cavernous chamber, the groaning voice was all anyone could hear. Toril ground her teeth as they emerged from the passageway and lifted her torch up to fully see the hall. The light flickered as a cold current blew through the gallery, and she turned to see about a dozen other tunnels lined up beside the one they'd just come from. They'd have openings all across the island, she had no doubt about it. She spotted another of Sigurd's red spots of paint, marking out their routes so that they did not get lost, and then turned to take in the chamber. The light of their torches barely illuminated the walls closest to them, let alone the hall itself, and Toril found herself staring into pitch black on all sides.
Where is Sigurd?
Inga had to shout above the reverberating groan that seemed to come from every passageway at once. "He must be here!" Her own voice sounded thin and soft, but her friend nodded anyway. Rather than shout again, Toril pointed to Jarl Halvor, and they both started to walk towards him. Before they reached him, Inga raised a hand and turned to Toril. She pointed to an ear and frowned. Almost as quickly as it had begun, the groaning voice on the wind had gone quiet. "Is that the good thing?" Inga bit her lower lip and watched to see how the Jarl would respond. Halvor raised a hand, bringing the company to a halt, and tilted his head. He stood like that for a moment, listening to the darkness. It was only then that Toril saw a flicker of movement amongst the shadows made by their torches. She squinted and lifted her own torch higher to dispel the void that surrounded them. Her breath caught in her mouth as another figure moved within the shadows, and then another. Just beyond the orange glow, shapes had begun to emerge, dozens of them, until the whole cavern seemed filled with darting forms, moving in and out of the light. Toril could make out faces now, as the inhabitants of the cave grew more brazen. Wrapped in cloth and bound by rope, the leering visages that greeted her were misshapen and deformed, like the skull they'd uncovered in the valley. To see such disfigurement brought to life made her stomach churn, and she felt herself shrink back behind her shield. "They carry no weapons." Toril looked and watched as one of the figures stepped into the light, before disappearing once again. Inga was right. The man was unarmed and unarmoured. Aside from the rags he wore and the head bindings, he carried nothing. "We will make short work of this." The shield maiden grinned beneath her own torch and strode forward more confidently than before. Despite the appearance of the Watchers, they made little attempt to attack or slow the war party. They kept to the edges of the light and tracked them as they moved deeper and deeper into the cavern. Toril noticed more tunnels on the walls, and some even on the floor beneath them. She was sure there were more above their heads, but the ceiling was shrouded in a darkness not even the light of their fires could push back. More of the deformed figures appeared from these passages, but they kept their distance, content to watch Halvor and his bloodied move through the cavern. Toril felt her foot step in something wet, and stared down at a small pool of water, then dragged her boot out and tried to kick it dry. Orve was knelt down beside another of the puddles, his brow furrowed.
"It is salt water."
"But we are days from the sea."
"Maybe. But these tunnels, we do not know how deep they go, or what lies beneath the island. They may be flooded by the sea when it storms."
She cared little about the comings and goings of the tide, or for flooding tunnels, provided she was not there when next it happened. The puddles of water grew more numerous and larger. She was sure she saw movement within some of the black pools, silver shapes writhing within their depths, but when she looked closer, there was nothing. Inga was the first to notice a change in the ground beneath their feet. She let out a groan and pointed her torch at the floor. Toril felt her hackles raise as something broke under her boots. The others were noticing it too, and even Halvor spat in disgust. The floor was littered with hundreds of bones, and one could hardly make out the ground beneath them. It was like staring at some macabre shoreline. Toril saw more of the warped skulls, elongated and serpentine in shape, but there were others too. The skeletons of all manner of beasts blanketed the chamber, and cracked beneath their feet as they moved over them. The Watchers maintained their distance, but seemed less rushed to get out of the Norseman's way, and Halvor nearly caught one with the side of his axe. Others darted back into the tunnels whenever the band made to attack them, but it was clear they were readying for a fight. When they had walked for some time over the bone carpet, Halvor called the party to a halt.
"Listen,"
he said, as his warriors sipped from their flasks and wiped the sweat from their brows. Deep inside the cavernous chamber, Toril could hear the sound of a drum ringing out. It beat out a slow rhythm, but the sound was unmistakable. Another sound joined that of the percussion, a low hum that seemed to echo through the tunnels.
Where did they go?
Uskar turned to the gathered warriors and waved a hand at the empty tunnels. He was right. The Watchers had disappeared, leaving only the Vikings in the chamber. The drumbeat upped its tempo, and Toril felt the hair on the back of her neck rise as a foul voice joined it. It droned out words she could not understand, but the meaning was clear. Death. The end. Other voices joined it, singing out from a great distance, but closing in with every chanted note.
Shield wall!
Halvor called, dropping his own flask and lifting his axe. His warriors rushed to obey, and wood clashed against wood as the Vikings joined in a defensive formation. The shadows around them started to move, but this time, the figures were not content to hide away. They raced towards the band, charging across the bone floor, even as their feet were cut to shreds by the jagged remains. The voice in the chamber reached a sickening crescendo, and suddenly hundreds of torches were lit all around them, finally illuminating the chamber entirely. Toril nearly balked at the sight. The bone floor stretched out as far as she could see, and there was no visible end to the cavern itself. She'd been right about the tunnels above their heads. The ceiling was covered by them, as was large swathes of the floor. What caused her to flinch, however, was the sheer number of figures that were bearing down on them. There were hundreds. Some were hunched over, their deformities afflicting more than just their skulls, while others seemed small and ungainly on their feet. It didn't matter, unarmed or not. She didn't know if they could be beaten. Halvor beat his axe against his shield in a steady tempo, over the sound of the drum in the depths. He glanced at his warriors and grinned. This was what Halvor was made for, overcoming the odds and proving the gods favoured him. Toril felt her nerves calm, even as the cave dwellers bore down on them. She dropped her torch, no longer needing it, and drew her sword.
Brace!
Halvor leaned into his shield, as did the rest of the company. When the horde of deformed monstrosities met the shield wall, it was with a blood-curdling scream, followed by the crump of bones breaking and flesh being torn. Toril threw her weight behind her shield and stabbed out between a narrow gap formed between her and Inger's shield. She was rewarded with a garbled cry, and the pressure against her arm was relieved before another body flung itself at her. She repeated the process again and again until her arm grew tired, but still she carried on. Blood covered the floor, running in a steady stream across the bones, and still they carried on. Jarl Halvor shouted out orders, pushing the press ever forward as they butchered their way through Fritjof's murderers. The savage people that inhabited the cave were unrelenting, despite their losses, despite their lack of weapons. They used their numbers against the Norse, and Toril saw more than one of her brothers pulled down by their sheer weight, before the shield wall closed around the gap again. When she felt she could not lift her sword again, and the sweat in her eyes was blurring her vision, the attack finally faltered. The steady beat of the drum in the distance finally fell silent, and the only sound was the bark of Halvor and the screams of those who fell beneath their blades.
Finish!
Halvor cried, breaking from the shield wall. He swung his axe in a vicious arc, dispatching 2 foes in as many seconds, then catching another with the back of his boot. He smashed his shield down into the mutant's skull until it stopped moving.
With the Jarl!
The shield wall broke, releasing 20 angry Norsemen upon the thinning ranks of the cave dwellers. Toril charged out with Inger, leaving Orvir to deal with the wounded abhorrents strewn across the battleground. Tired as she was, she felt her strength renewed at the thought of avenging her fallen raid mates, and of bringing this cult of death to an end. Her sword slashed at exposed necks and chests, arms and legs, until all she saw was blood. It was only when the last of the death worshippers had disappeared down the tunnels, and the beating drum had faded for good, that she heard the soft, sibilant whisper. She glanced around her and saw that others had noticed it too. Most of the warriors were standing still now, listening to the wind, and Toril was gladdened to see so many of their number left. She flinched as the hissing sound grew louder and turned back to the tunnels that surrounded the chamber. Theodoric was walking towards the nearest opening, his head cocked to the side as he sought out the source, while the rest of the company slowly edged back towards Halvor. Any ideas?
You have already seen it. You know what lurks beneath the tide.
Orve closed his eyes and shrugged.
Now we must meet it.
Toril crinkled her brow and held back a snarl at the old man's words. It is... Her words were cut off by a cry of alarm, and then a high-pitched scream. She turned towards the tunnels in time to see a flicker of silver, and the smooth scales of a gigantic form as it moved past the nearest opening. A giant tail appeared for a moment, and then it was gone, leaving an opening as empty as it was a moment before. Toril felt her heart pounding in her chest, and her legs started to shake beneath her. Theodoric was running back towards them, a look of primal fear on his usually stoic features.
It is Jormungandr! The Midgard serpent is here!
Halvor shook his head, but gripped his axe tight in his hand.
Stand fast!
He cried, but his voice wavered and his face was pale.
We are Odin's kin, and we do not run!
From the tunnels all around them, another wave of figures appeared. They started to sing in that strange tongue of theirs, and Toril could hear the drum pick up its beat in the distance again. Her whole body was shaking now, as fear gripped her heart. She thought it would stop entirely, but a hand clutched her shoulder gently, and she turned to find Orve smiling at her.
We must not fear this.
The hiss was growing louder, and it seemed to come from all the passages at once.
Soon we will either feast in the halls of our fathers, or we will kill this thing and become like gods ourselves.
She took a deep breath and nodded, somehow conjuring up a smile for Orve. The old warrior patted her on the shoulder again, and then joined the shield wall beside her. When the great serpent finally appeared, it was from one of the holes above the gathered Norsemen. The beast pushed through debris, sprinkling them all with stone and dust, before it thrust its head out into the open. Toril nearly cried out, but kept her fears in check as the giant snake slithered out into the cavern. The creature was impossibly large, its head the length and breadth of a longship, while its body seemed without end. Row upon row of fangs emerged from behind black gums, and massive red orbs stared out from its arrowhead-like face. 2 muscular appendages hung from the beast's sides, and ended in sharp claws the size of a man. The silver scales that covered it were a mess of scars, and massive cuts long since healed. What creature could do such a thing to such a beast, Toril wondered, as it lowered itself to the ground. All around them, the snake worshippers were emerging, chanting and cheering as the serpent moved closer to the Norsemen. Some were foolish enough to get too close to the snake and were crushed beneath its coils. Others moved to flank the serpent and encircled the Vikings so that there was no clear route of escape. Though, by the look on Halvor's face, escape was not on his mind. The Norseman rolled his shoulders and tested the sharpness of his blade against his forearm.
You see this?
He raised his arm and nodded to the thin stream of blood running along it.
This blood is the blood of Norse, of Odin's son. It is the blood of Freya and of Vali. It is the blood of Baldur. This blood is the same blood that will course through Tur when Ragnarok comes, and Fenris and Jormungandr light fire to the world. It is like poison to the beast.
He looked over his shoulder at the approaching serpent and the gathering cultists.
Now, help me kill it!
His warriors moved in behind him, still in shock at the sight of the serpent, but emboldened by his words. Halvor seemed to grow before them, his size and strength swelling to match his words. For a moment, it seemed that they could perform this impossible task, that they could slay this beast with axe and sword, with spear and shield. Indeed, when Halvor moved into a loping run, his axe raised and a war cry on his lips, it seemed an inevitability. Toril chased after him, her own sword raised, howling and cursing with the rest of the band as they closed on the serpent. The creature hesitated, unused to being attacked, unused to anything but fear. It gave Halvor the time he needed to make the last few meters. He leapt into the air, pushing aside the cultists who scrambled into his way, and embedded his axe in the serpent's side. The beast lashed out, but Halvor had already rolled out of the way and retrieved a short blade from his belt. Then the rest of them were on it. Toril stabbed deep into the creature's quivering flesh, yanking her sword back and vomiting as the stench of rotten fish erupted from the wound. She wiped her mouth and fell back before the thing could slam its tail down on where she'd just been. Others thrust their blades into the creature's flank, while the rest took to clearing up the horde of deformed that was still biting at their heels. She caught sight of Halvor crawling up the snake's flank, using his stabbing blade like a climbing tool, and then he was gone, hidden behind the beast's lashing body. Inga crashed in beside her and cut down with her blade, piercing through flesh and bone. She grinned madly at Toril, and then rolled out of the way before the serpent could react. The Norsemen were clinical in their approach, and dozens of the snake worshippers were killed, even as the serpent itself was cut to a bloody mess. Still, the beast's skin was thick, and its scales deflected much of the damage done. Uskar was the first to fall. He lingered too long trying to retrieve his spear from the snake's chest. The beast didn't even use its fangs to kill him. It simply smashed its head down against the ground he was standing on, leaving nothing but a red paste behind. The next to fall was Theodoric. Encouraged by the Jarl's actions, he tried to clamber up the side of the snake in order to get close to its head. His hand slipped against the smooth scales and he tumbled to the ground, only to be crushed beneath the serpent's coils. For a while, they fought like heroes, battling back both serpent and cultist. Blood ran like rivers from the creature's flanks, and great welts had formed all along its chest. The warriors learned to move and duck out of the way whenever it slammed its body against the ground, and roll out of range of its massive coils. Toril fought harder than she'd ever fought before, and was rewarded time and time again as blood spewed out from the creature's wounds. Even the serpent's worshippers began to doubt the strength of their god, and a great cry went up each time one of the Vikings impaled the beast. But the creature was old, and it had fought many battles. When it finally caught sight of Halvor climbing between its scales, the serpent struck with blinding speed. The Jarl let out a cry as the creature caught him between its jaws, and a massive fang penetrated his chest. Toril nearly dropped her sword and fled, but anger coursed through her at the last second, and she found herself slashing out at the beast violently. To his credit, when Halvor died, it was with a sword in his hands and a howl on his lips. Even as the serpent tore the life from him, he sunk his knife deep into the creature's gums, causing it to thrash madly, before it flung the lifeless corpse across the bone fields. Halvor's bloodied fought on for a while longer, but with each moment that passed, another of their number fell. Norsemen were consumed whole by the creature's gaping maw, crushed beneath its coils, or swarmed by the cultists. Tommen, then Ava, Henrik, and then Ove and Inger. All of them were butchered. Toril screamed in rage as a serpent killed them, until a hand pulled her away from the fight and she was running, fleeing from the end of the world, back the way she'd come. She didn't know where the torch had come from, but she held it out before her as she ran. The sounds of battle had long since faded, and all she could hear were her feet sloshing through puddles and cracking old bones. Those who had fled with her were dead. Caught by ambush after ambush of the serpent worshippers, only Toril remained. She had to survive. Only she could tell the saga of Halvor and his band of bloodied. She paused at the entrance to one of the tunnels and saw that a red mark had been painted on the wall. Sigurd, she thought as she moved towards the entrance. She frowned and looked at the floor. She didn't remember there being bones at the entrance to the tunnel. Her torch still raised, she walked over to the next tunnel and saw that the same mark had been painted on its walls, and on the next, and the next. Toril shivered as the torch began to flicker. She didn't have long before it went out. Gritting her teeth to hold back the fear that threatened to overwhelm her, she moved on. If she could just find the right tunnel, she had a chance. In the depths of the cavern, a drum began to beat. You've been listening to The Bone Field by Mitchell Lüthi, performed by Anna Capraro and Scott Miller. Production copyright for Sentinel Creatives.